So uh, if you don't mind, we'll get into it, and then I'll be soft pitching you things. So I'm not trying to trick you or
Gotcha.
whatnot.
You're not
So
trying to get me?
I'm not trying to get you. We'll just get into it. I'll start with the intro,
Sure.
and we'll go for it.
Okay,
All
sounds
right.
good.
This is Andre Koen for another episode of Speaking of Diversity and Inclusion here at Mayo Clinic. Um, right now, we're in a time of lots of chaos and ambiguity. People are clamoring for answers when, in some cases, there aren't answers. We do know that data, statistics, historical context, and science can give us some answers, but they don't necessarily have the answers. And so, how do we make sense of a world that's in chaos? How do we make sense out of the uncertainties that are in our at our doorstep? And I think a large part of that is that we take control of those things. And so I have Keely Heron here who's going to us a little bit about how she escaped from the now what was your TED talk? The title of your TED talk was escaping from
It was the cult of happiness.
cult of happiness. That's right, the cult
Yeah.
of
So it was
happiness.
leaving the cult of happiness.
Leaving the cult of happiness. And so I've asked her to kind of have a conversation with us because how do we actually deal with situations that aren't good situations to be in, right? How do we maximize our own potential in contexts that aren't really all that great, right? So Keely, tell us a little bit about you and some of the work that you've done.
Well, I'm originally from Minnesota, and I grew up here, and I went to the University of Minnesota. And my career has largely been in advertising and marketing. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about human behavior and why people make the decisions that they do. And also, concurrently, not as a professional, I have been involved in mental health advocacy, and that was driven by my father's suicide in 1999. And after that, I became involved in working with an organization called SAVE, which is Suicide Awareness Voices of Education. And I am currently on the Speakers Bureau for NAMI,
Oh
Minnesota,
yeah.
and I do um, talks about my own experience with obviously suicide and mental illness, as well as my own experience with sexual trauma and complex post traumatic stress disorder.
All right. So it's interesting that you brought NAMI up because we've done some podcasts for NAMI. So that's and also some training for NAMI. Let's get into some of the parts that are more intriguing for me, right? So first of all, what was it like to do a TED Talk? So let's start there, and then we'll come back to the more weighty stuff. But I'm just curious, what was that like for you to stand up and do a TED Talk?
Well, I should clarify that it was a TEDx talk.
Okay.
It wasn't. I just have to clarify that because they are different entities. TEDx Jackson Hole was the organization that I spoke for. And so I was living in Jackson and I was invited to do a talk. I had been participating in, they're called story slams. I don't know if you've heard of the Moth Radio Hours,
Oh yeah.
but we had a local version in Jackson. And I had been doing those. And at one of them, a friend of mine who was on the TEDx committee, um, she was in the audience and she said, we should talk. Jackson Hole was in the path of totality for the total solar eclipse in 2017, and the theme was out of darkness.
Mm.
And so that was very coincidental for me because I had participated in walks for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And the name of those walks is the Out of Darkness Walks. So, as we talked about, me participating in the TEDx event in 2017, it became really obvious that the suicide part of my story, which is my father's story, And that would be an obvious thing that I would, but as the coaches helped me develop the talk, it became clear that the story of my experience with sexual trauma was a pretty significant part of that story as well. And I've always joked that when I die, you'll have to pull my cold dead hand. Public speaking, and there's something about connecting with the audience and having an opportunity to share something that is really important to me. It was a little daunting, I'm not going to lie, to get up on a stage in front of 500 people and talk about my deepest, darkest secrets that I had never really discussed publicly prior to that. So it took a lot of effort to get to the point where there was a point, where I had a call to action. Because I didn't want to just stand up on a stage and say, all of these horrible things happened to me, poor me, you should feel sorry for me. I wanted to get to a point in the talk where my experience illuminated a larger truth about the human experience and allowed me to share what I had learned from these challenges that I didn't ask for, didn't like, didn't have a choice in the matter, but nonetheless had to manage. And, there's pretty significant ongoing fallout from those types of experiences. And the past isn't always in the past.
Yep.
When you're talking about trauma. So yeah, it was a very thoughtful process of saying, okay, what is the point here?
So explain to me. So one of the things that intrigued me was frankly, the title, The Cult of Happiness. So can you tell us a little bit about this cult of happiness? What is that?
I made it up.
A marketer, right? I said,
yeah, advertising and marketing. That's part of what you do is you find something that's catchy or sticky or is interruptive that sort of makes you go, what? And it's interesting because since then, so I gave the talk in August of 2017, and since then I've learned about a term that's become pretty popular called toxic positivity. And I think that is an interesting term that's very, very similar to the idea that I was trying to get across with the cult of happiness, which is that, in American culture, in Western culture, broadly, but definitely in American culture, there is this idea that we can only be happy, that we can only be positive, that that it's not polite, it's not acceptable to discuss things that are negative. We don't want to be a Debbie Downer. We don't want to trouble other people. And so there's this toxic element of positivity where even if we're really suffering, we put on a brave face. And, when somebody says, how are you? We know that they're not really asking how we are. We just say, oh, we're good.
and they really also get the message, and they have to, right? Yeah. So positive thing, because one of the things we're supposed to pretend is that although we're dealing with that, there's so many things we don't know that we've been taught. All these things are kind of biosphere we're supposed to are they're not dating, but we're supposed to do their online learning as if this is a normal situation. And I think are the problem with so-called.
I think I've learned through I've had the first step to really being able to effectively manage something that's unpleasant, unpleasant at best, and sometimes, incredibly harmful or malignant or dangerous. Step to being manage something is the ability to see it, to name it, to accept it, and to begin to understand it. And so I think when we talk about the cult of happiness or toxic positivity, we skip over the naming, accepting, understanding part and try to get to the part where like everything's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Another about idea is spiritual bypassing,
Mm-hmm.
which is popular. I call it the hashtag blessed culture,
Mm-hmm.
where we are, maybe our spiritual development, or maybe we are in the basement of our mood or happiness or ability to deal with something, um, dealing with something effective, managing something depressed. Diagnosis that's incredibly challenging. Um, you can't just push the elevator button, and go from depressed. Everything's great. You got to maybe you go up one level, stay there for a while. Have to do that was one of the main messages of my TEDx talk is the only way out is through.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just skip over all difficult parts and get to the part where fine up for a while, everything's a while, but eventually it's going to crack. It will crack because it's not built on anything real. It's a facade.
Yeah, I think because with I'm a social animal. I'm a people person. I can't audience with people, achieve a goal, challenge. Like this is a lot for me to be in this and what I feel is that I'm actually there is either a possibility or this of that is actually dying. And I'm mourning these things, right? Um, and I think sometimes when these changes happen, we don't give ourselves space. That's some of the things, and I go that cycle of that mourning cycle. Like, wow, no, this is I, something,
Yeah.
and I have to recognize that, and go through the cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that brings up a very good point about grief is not linear. We ping all around inside grief, and one great, and the next day, you know, you're in the pit of despair, and then between, and I mean, it's not linear. It's not like we begin here, move on to the next stage. It's like, especially in experience, where again, when I 2017, I didn't even, complex post-traumatic stress is not even a diagnosis at by the world, but it has not yet been recognized in the diagnostical manual, which means that it is not a diagnosis. You cannot be treated
For it.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. So, so as we talk about trauma, and it's very popular to talk about triggers, and negative things. It's like, oh, you're triggered, which, I get where that comes from, like that safe to express because someone's, but triggers are a real, if you have a trauma and you get right back in it. So as that pertains to, when you on dealing with grief or that you could get triggered 16 years later, go right back into that fight or flight and the skills to deal with it. I think my main message I always come back to compassion, judgment, listening, or passionate not witnessing. Because we all have burdens that we carry, and I think it's to allow oneself to recognize we're carrying, to see them, and to begin to able to have the capacity, tool, put mask over your nose, you help others. Talking about with your, I'm a social place, having that stimulus, that cup, so to speak, to just even have awareness that that is a loss, allows you to fill your cup in other ways. Having and wants to talk about, you're not like, but because it's hard for you. First of all, you need to say, yeah, I'm dealing with it. It's really hard. You don't have that. I'm going to shut you down and I'm going to shame you for having this reaction.
So that brings me to something that I think is very interesting, which is, people, you just, the situation is bad, so let's just build our resilience. Is there a time when no, I'm not going to build up a tolerance this particular being. Like, I don't want functional whatever. Do or at that point, how would you answer that?
Well, first, I need to be clear that
I'm not. Yep.
I don't have any training in those things. My insight from my own to help myself, and my desire to help others, what I've learned. I would say what has helped me is mindfulness training, and a lot of that for me out of my Buddhist on religion, that there is no God. It's and it's about things to be as they are without clinging or without aversion. Talk about shouldn't build up. Things are, whether or not they. And so, my approach to things that I don't like, that I can't control, is first to suffering, and down to it, accept, understand, and develop a tool to manage my emotion. For example, I get really fired quality. That really is one of my triggers. Income inequality, it probably, I don't think we should. Income inequality exists. I had to change it, my around it, and you know how it gets me all riled up. I try to alleviate my own on that, not riled up. Conscious while emotional response. I think that leads to a tool that I have personally found helpful, which is deep, stands for dialogue. Is basically saying that two things that appear completely opposite practical behavior and godsend for me, been life-changing, and the basis of that is, you know, it really does come down to a pretty premise, which is just to be mindful about what's going on, and to pause, to consider your knee-jerk reaction.
So what I recognize is that many of our listening audience participants are some of them are facing working in pretty intense. It struck me one of the for my own growth and development is cognitive behavior, right? So full of my feelings, how they influence my behavior, and controlling thoughts, right? So really direct those things towards my goal. And so as we kind of think about into account as a balanced relationship. So I really like the process that you presented, because I hope listeners are able to both can be true. Tremendous loss, tremendous at the same time. So is there any other, as we kind of this part, is there any would encourage people to do that are experiencing this, maybe that you know and chaotic, that you would encourage them to think about as they try to of this life?
Thing that I always remind myself to fill the space for it. So comparing trauma to someone else's trauma um, is never. I, I don't know if you've heard about the pain, where I'm saying, don't be upset because I have a place, have all these things in my life. I shouldn't feel sad because there are millions of people who don't have it. So I should just life and quit whining.
Mm.
Um, on some level, maybe that's true to you in your whatever you're dealing with, that you're struggling to deal with, and to remember that passion begins this idea, the mouth and mouth for others. It's just so basic. If you are not capable of helping yourself, others,
Mm.
and, you know, if someone, you don't jump out of the boat with them, you know, you always have to help yourself first,
Mm-hmm.
and that is selfish, responsible. That is taking accountability for yourself. If you're struggling, your job is to ask for help and begin to shift from the cult of happiness where we, are armored and it's all about I have to achieve and I have to show the world that I'm whatever idea it is that I think I need to show the world. If we shift from that cult of happiness more to passion, where it's more collective, the root of the word passion is to suffer together. The Latin root is to suffer together. It's a that my suffering is not only mine. If I am capable of becoming becoming resilient to myself, I am more capable. And so the first thing is to be compassionate to yourself and to not have negative and tell yourself that you're weak for feeling bad.
Yeah.
That doesn't get you anywhere except for feeling more badly. Opposite of helping them.
Yeah. So it's something that you bring uh, our mission statement. Needs of the patient come first, and that operation. I also hear you saying the helpers who are helping the needs of the patient should be a consideration. Right? That also that also. So, for taking time to talk with us for more information about Keely and
Minnesota state chapter of NAMI Minnesota also see classes for those who actively for mental illness, resources for friends supporting a loved with a mental illness. And I can't say enough good about NAMI Minnesota and leadership there. They've been a tremendous asset to people, living with mental illness in the state of Florida. And they do a lot of work with the for people living with mental illness. So I'm very proud to be an advocate on their support.
that you would speak with us today. Conversation.
DBT, that are available, and just the idea of being, you have to start with yourself.
Good. I just want to say doing this. My notes, you hit things that were on my notes, so I didn't have to eat very much.
Sorry, yeah, I tend to
No, it's
talk a lot.